Hello, everyone, and welcome to Recipe for Reality Small Bites, where I take a smaller topic in the grand echelon of Survivor and break it down depending on the theme of the week, depending on what we've been watching on Survivor 46. And this week, spoiler alert, this was the Banu episode, his big boot episode, but it really has been, if you look at it in a grand lens, the Banu season. Banu from Yanu really eating up the screen time, so much so to where people have made the comparisons of confessional counts, and Banu has had more confessionals than people like Natalie White, who won Survivor Samoa, or even someone who is very well known and very popular, Parvati Shallow, who won Micronesia. Banu has more confessionals than both of them, and I think that just goes to show that obviously now there are 90-minute episodes, and we had the first two episodes being 2-hour episodes, so I get their confessional counts are going to be bigger, but if you just look at sheer minutes as well, I mean, the amount of time spent on Banu in these 4 episodes really had me thinking about who the most memorable or most visible pre-mergers are of all time, because there are so many great characters in the echelon of Survivor, so many characters that have played multiple times, so many characters that have played once but made it deep. But then I start to think about all the people who have only played once, but have still left an impact to where we're still talking about them today, we're still thinking about them today. And these are not necessarily the top 10 players pre-merge wise. Actually, in fact, I think these are actually some pretty bad players that I have on the top 10 list. At least most of them are pretty bad players. But I just wanted to think about the ones that stick out to me, the most memorable people, not even most memorable characters, but just having the most memorable impact on those given seasons and on the grander scope of Survivor at large. And this was obviously inspired by Banu. So congratulations, Banu. You are a game changer in one way or another. But yeah, I'm going to be going through all of Survivor. I'm going to kind of go season by season because I have so many honorable mentions to get to. Now, there are names of people that obviously come to mind as huge, pre-merge characters. Some that are really like negative pre-merge characters, like Ben Browning from Samoa, or Shannon Elkins from Nicaragua, or John Rocker from San Juan del Sur. I considered them, but at the end of the day, I think the spirit of this list would be more fun if I highlighted people who were memorable for reasons other than being problematic on the island. I also did consider some first boots that I talked about in my first boot video. Only one first boot actually made the list, but I did consider Zane Knight from the Philippines, who is my personal favorite for first boot, and of course David Jelinski, who was most recently on Survivor 46, but as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think Jelinski himself has now been usurped by another member of his cast that I think is just more memorable if you just look at this whole season as a whole. Isn't that wild that we're leaving this pre-merge where Jelinski isn't the most chaotic and most present figure of that pre-merge? Ponderosa. It just goes out to show how crazy of a season we're probably in for with 46. But I'm going to go through every season and just kind of talk about, or every season that I considered, and talk about the pre-mergers who didn't make the cut. And I also want to make one last little asterisk. I'm not including any multiple time players. So despite Francesca or Russell Swan playing multiple times and getting pre-merged multiple times, I felt like for the spirit of this list, I wanted to keep it solely to one-time players, because I really think it's interesting to look at people who have only played once but who still have this lasting impact on the game. I didn't consider anyone from Survivor Borneo, but I did consider from Survivor the Australian Outback, Marilyn Mad Dog Hershey. She was always just a favorite character of mine, but that season is so stacked with great characters, so many of them who have returned, so I didn't consider her at the end of the day. Marquesas, I considered Hunter Ellis because he was one of those really shocking early blindsides. He's kind of Boston Rob's first victim in Survivor, but I think he's more memorable because he was a strong guy booted early rather than being Hunter himself booted early. I think it's more for what he stands for rather than who he actually is as a character in the game. From Survivor Thailand, I consider Rob Zabachnik, who is just absolutely wild, but let's be honest, none of the Thailand players really linger on my mind quite that much. Palau was hard because I kind of considered all of Oolong. The thing with Oolong is that they edited that tribe really well to where I don't think there's one standout character except for Stephanie, but obviously Stephanie made the merge. From Cook Islands, I did consider Billy Garcia. His little 2-episode arc with Candace and him finding love on the island is one of the funniest storylines I've ever seen, but I did put someone else from Cook Islands on the list who I think had just a larger impact on the game at large. I considered Lisi from Survivor Fiji, who is just a mess of a character, but I honestly kind of forget she's pre-merged because she does technically make the jury, but Lisi's an all-time catastrophe of a person on the the island. I mean, she might be great in real life, but on the island, she is just an utter mess, which is very entertaining. But honestly, kind of like Thailand, Fiji doesn't necessarily linger on my mind quite as much, so I didn't consider her. From Survivor China, my very first season, I mean, I think the pre-merger who sticks out the most is Dave Cruiser, but again, I just think there are bigger, more flashier characters on this cast. I actually considered a lot of people from Gabon, and I didn't actually put on anyone from Gabon, strictly because I couldn't figure out which one to put on, and I think they are all very impactful, but not one stands above the others. You have someone like Jillian, who is just such a big presence of those first few episodes. You have someone like GC, who is just a train wreck on that season. Ace, who is a huge domineering figure, his fake accent and everything. You also have Marcus, who is a very quiet person, but also was kind of everyone's winner pick headed into his boot episode, to where when he went home, no one really knew who was going to win, and I think people still didn't know who was going to win until the finale, when Bob kind of snuck up there and got that W. So I considered all of them from Gabon, but ultimately didn't go with any of them. For Survivor Nicaragua, I did consider Jimmy Johnson, but I think the reason he's memorable is because he's Jimmy Johnson, not necessarily for anything he did on Survivor. From South Pacific, I did have to consider Christine and, of course, Stacy. Two people who were really kind of the antithesis to Coach's storyline. Stacy in particular, with all those little quips at Benjamin, as she would say. But ultimately, she was probably number 11 or 12 on this list, but ultimately she missed the cut. Same for Cagayan. I mean, Garrett being such a huge pre-merge character, I just think there's someone else from his tribe who's a little bit more memorable. And of course, Bryce, who I think is now more memorable because of all the stuff he's done outside of Survivor, less so than the stuff he did on Survivor. But that is just such a memorable season, so a lot of those pre-merge characters are so memorable still, because I think that season's talked about a lot. Survivor Blood vs. Water, I did consider Marissa Peterson. She is technically like the first vote out, even though she's not the first boot, but she definitely has some amazing moments, especially the FU Brad Culpepper moment. Ultimately, though, she came up short. She was probably like number 12 or 13 on this list. And then I considered a slew of people from Ghost Island, because I think that pre-merge in and of itself is probably the best cast of a pre-merge, and I think that's why the season suffers, because all the great players, except for, I would say, or at least the great characters, except for like Chris Noble, Dominic Wendell, and maybe like Kellen and Donathan, they all go out pre-merge. So like someone like Jacob Derwin, who's a train wreck on the island, even the first Boo Gonzalez. You have like James Lim, who's very memorable. Bradley Kleige is really great, and then one who I really considered, she was like the number 11, is Stephanie Johnson. The only thing is that I don't think Stephanie Johnson is really this huge, larger than life personality, but when I think of that season and that pre-merge, I mean, Stephanie is such a huge focal point of that pre-merge, so it's a shame that we didn't get to see her play longer. But ultimately, there was no one person that like inspired me enough to put them on a top 10 list of most memorable pre-mergers in the grand scheme of Survivor. Moving on to David vs. Goliath, I did consider Natalia and Larsa, but ultimately there's one person that I think really dominated the pre-merge in terms of memorability. And then from this new era, I did consider JD from 41, a very memorable pre-merger, as well as Brad, who kind of dominated all the screen time in his boot episode, so much so to where he had so many confessionals and very little other people had confessionals, but ultimately they just came up short, also because their impact, when I'm thinking of putting this list together, who is still going to stand the test of time 20 seasons from now, and I think someone like JD or someone like Brad might fall by the wayside, whereas some of the other new era players I put on the top 10 list I think are going to be much more memorable and continue to be memorable. And then most recently from Survivor 45, I mean, Brandon, obviously, for being a train wreck in challenges, but being so endearing, is definitely a very memorable character. And then Sabaya, who is a really savvy player, and I really want to see more of her in the grand scheme of Survivor. I hope she gets to play again someday, but she's not a big enough character for me to put her on this list, but she is certainly memorable, especially right now with the season just having recently passed. But now let's get into the top 10. This is very loosely ranked. Like, it's hard to rank these 10 in any specific order, but at number 10, I started off with someone who kind of gets an asterisk because, they have this kind of dark cloud above them because they did quit the game, but some say maybe they were kind of prompted by production to leave the game because they weren't in the best mental state, but it is someone who I think did dominate a lot of the screen time, especially for the fans tribe on Micronesia, and that is Kathy. I think Kathy is someone that when you watch the first half of the season, or the first third, I would say, that whole pre-merge, I mean, except for the favorites tribe, which obviously has some big characters. I mean, you have Johnny Fairplay and Suri and Parvati, Amanda, James, Jonathan Penner, Yowman, but if you look at the fans tribe, there really is only focal point in maybe the Chet and Joel drama, but then really Kathy is the dominating source of entertainment, source of storyline. I think that's because she goes to Exile Island plenty of times, but when I think of that season, I think of the fans. Kathy is probably the first fan that comes to mind, next to maybe like Eric, who makes it deep in the game, or Jason, who plays the stick. But really, Kathy, despite quitting the game, they really gave her a pretty prominent edit. And like I said, I do think, you know, her quit is a little bit more production mandated. I think production kind of saw that the signs were going south and kind of prompted her to quit. You know, obviously the production team's not allowed to say, like, you need to leave the game. Well, I guess they can, because that's how medevacs happen sometimes. But I don't necessarily think production told her, like, you need to leave the game. But I think they were kind of asking her, like, do you think you need to leave type deal? I don't know. It's hard because there's so many behind the scenes stories and so many theories out there that I don't want to theorize too much on why Kathy did leave. I mean, it's quite evident when you see the show why she left, but exactly how that went about. But I do think she is a very big part of that season, and I do think she's a big part of that entertainment. I think she fuels Ozzy's storyline and Cerie's storyline because you get that kind of fan and favorite interaction from her, and I think because these fan versus favorites seasons, a lot of the people who are recruited aren't always fans. It's really refreshing to see Kathy, who is a fan, playing on this tribe. So you get a lot of great commentary from her about the favorites tribe as well. So I think Kathy is one of those big, you know, personalities on a season that is mostly dominated by returning players, which is why I think she stands out even more. At number 9 is someone who, again, kind of went out in a similar fashion, not in a quit necessarily, but more of a medical evacuation quit type deal. And that is Matthew from Survivor 44. I just talked about him on my Medevacs video last week, so I'm not going to go too in depth on what I think about Matthew as a player, but he is a very memorable figure, and I think he would be higher on the list if 44 wasn't so recent, and because 44 was still so dominated by Carolyn, Jam, and Carson, that I do think when people think of 44, they're going to think of the Tika 3 first, but then I think if you think about anyone else, you're probably going to think about Matthew, because he was kind of the focal point of the pre-merge. He wasn't just memorable for falling off that rock and getting hurt, but he did that sweat task with Brandon in episode 1. He's memorable for playing his shot in the dark so he wouldn't have to vote and get blood on his hands. He found the idol. He re-hit a fake idol. Jamie found that idol. I think he did a lot in his short amount of time, to where I think, honestly, with time, he's probably going to go up this list. But because of his medevac, I think it's harder because all these other people I'm going to talk about got voted out. So there's something to that as well. Whereas Matthew didn't really get that vote out. And I think when you think about people's legacies on Survivor, a lot of people go toward the vote out. And how did they react? And did they go out guns blazing? Did they go out, spoiler alert, with their jackets? So Matthew is low on this list, but I think with time, he could certainly bump up. At number 8, I have someone who might not have come to everyone's mind right away, but if you look at that season in particular, he is someone who I thought was going to be an endgame player based on the premiere episode alone, but ended up going out pretty early due to a tribe swap where he just ended up in the minority without an idol, and that's Alan Ball from Heroes vs. Healers vs. Hustlers. This is a season I don't like very much, but I think the pre-merge is honestly more entertaining than the post-merge, just because the post-merge is just so dominated by Ben and his idols, and obviously the fire-making twist has like a sour tint on the whole season, and I really like Lauren, but she goes out earlier than I think she should. But I think the pre-merge is really solid, and I think Alan Ball, you know, there's a lot of catastrophic gameplay from all over the place. I mean, Patrick being a good example as well. But I think Alan Ball is someone who actually, I think, has the chops to be a good player, but he just played way too aggressively and way too strong out the gate. I mean, the scene where he asked JP to strip so he can find the idol, I mean, that is just so over the top and crazy. Alan does cool down in episodes like 2 and 3, and, you know, he doesn't get as much screen time in the following episodes, but his boot episode is also very memorable too, because it's the big episode where Joe plays his idol correctly, and him and Desi are able to stay. So I think Alan just has very big moments on a season that itself is dominated by 1 or 2 big players, to where I think Alan is a really memorable figure if you look at the grand scheme of the 30s era of Survivor, where it's like post Heroes Villains and post Cambodia but pre New Era. I think in that era, Alan Ball is one of those big personalities that I think you remember when you think of that season. At number 7 is someone who I think is now kind of indoctrined into the legacy of Survivor because he invented one of the biggest strategies of Survivor, and he's on a season with some memorable people, but I think he is the most memorable of the pre-mergers, and that is Cowboy from Survivor Cook Islands, who is obviously now most known for his vote-splitting strategy, which is something we see now in mostly every season, almost every vote in the new era, especially with idols and stuff. I mean, Cook Islands is one of the first seasons to really have idols be such a big part of the strategy. I mean, that's why Yule ultimately wins, is because he's able to navigate the idol play so well and get Penner on his side and all these things. But we're not talking about Yule. We're not talking about Penner. We're talking about Cowboy, because Cowboy is the one to first kind of declare this strategy. Now, have other contestants maybe thought about splitting votes to prevent idols? Idols were still very fresh at the time. I mean, Panama was just before that, and I believe Panama and Guatemala were the only other seasons with idols. So obviously, it probably wasn't around long enough to actually come up with a plan, and someone else would have come up with a plan if it weren't Cowboy, but Cowboy did come up with a plan first, so you got to give him that credit. But even beside the fact that he created this game-changing strategy of splitting votes to prevent idols from idling out someone, and putting votes on multiple people to prevent yourself from going home, he also is just a very big character. He's a very memorable presence, and that's why I didn't put Billy Garcia on this list, because I think if you look at that pre-merge, Billy has the most iconic moment, but Cowboy, I think, kind of dominates the screen time there, and is really one of those kind of like coach-like figures where he's almost a little delusional, but you enjoy watching it, like a Philip Shepard or something like that. And I do think if Cowboy does make a deep run in the game, he is someone who is a lock for returning seasons and comes back to play a bunch of times. Now, did he make some comments that are a little not too favorable in the modern lens? Yes, but I do think Cowboy, because he is such a big presence on his season and because he created that vote split strategy, I think you have to give him a lot of credit, and that is why he is on this list at number 7. At number 6, someone who is just such a train wreck on their season, and again, on a season with so many big characters, like Coach, who I just mentioned, like Tyson, like JT, like Steven, and that is Sandy from Survivor Tocantins. Now, the beginning of that game, I mean, that whole first episode when Sandy essentially gets voted out, only to find out that she's not voted out of her game, she was just voted by her tribe, and she gets to make this game-changing twist. Sandy really dominates that premiere episode because she is a very outspoken person. She's one of the older people in her season, which already makes you stick out a bit. And because of the pacing, when they're kind of prepping for the challenges and they're talking about a pace, and she asks what a pace is. What's a pace? I don't know what a pace is. Her southern twang or southern accent. I mean, Sandy's just one of the most memorable pre-mergers for me. Every time I watch Tocantins, I'm kind of sad to see Sandy go because it means some of the entertainment is gone. Even though I know Coach and Tyson and Steven, they're all on the season. Taj too. But something about Sandy leaving always kind of like makes the season worse for me, to where I really did want to put her in the top 5, but I know for other people, she's not necessarily the first name that comes to mind, whereas I think the 5 people above Sandy on this list are people that, like, if you were to say the name, everyone knows that name. Like, everyone would be like, oh yeah, this person. Whereas I think Sandy now, because so much time has passed, maybe she's not necessarily at the front of people's minds, but Sandy is such a big personality, such a big character, an antagonistic character, but a lovable one at the same time. Just one of those really great train wreck players who I'm sure is just such a sweetheart in real life, but on the island, it's just such great entertainment. So Sandy comes in here at number 6. At number 5 is someone who I struggled where to put her because I think she's mostly memorable for one moment. But if you go back and watch the season, she's definitely a dominant presence throughout, but it really is for that jacket moment, and it is Natalie Cole from David vs. Goliath. Everyone knew I was putting her on the list. I mean, she is one of the most iconic, pre-mergers of this kind of new wave of Survivor in the 30s, I would say. Her moment, Angelina's moment where she's like, Natalie, can I have your jacket? And Natalie ignores her, and then Natalie in the, post-vote confessional basically talks about how she's like, I don't know if Angelina gave me her vote, so I'm not going to give her my jacket. I mean, the whole jacket feud is so good, and I think that's what she's now remembered for most of all, for the meme of that. But if you watch that season, I mean, that whole first few episodes is her rivalry with Jeremy, and then even when Jeremy goes, I mean, she is just such a focal point of the strategy, of the gameplay. I mean, she is such an anomaly. I mean, she's obviously older, which works for her benefit because, like I said with Sandy, when you're the oldest person on a tribe full of young people, you do stand out and you probably get more screen time just because you're also different. You have a different way of thinking, a different way you go about your life, and your different values and your different mindset and approach to things, which I think also is what's so intriguing about Natalie's confessionals and why she's so memorable in confessionals. I just really like Natalie. I think Natalie's someone who I'd love to see on a returning season because I don't think she would ever make it far in the game, but she would always bring something to it. And I just think Natalie is one of the great all-time pre-merge characters and most memorable. Even with that moment aside, she has so many other great moments that I think are honestly underrated at this point because that one moment kind of takes a lot of heat. It takes a lot of the attention away from the other moments. But at number 4 is someone who I struggled to put them because it is the most recent person on the list. It is the person who inspired this video. It is Banu. And the reason I put him at number 4 is because the people above him, I think right now, because it has been enough time since their seasons have happened, they've kind of built the legacy since, whereas Banu hasn't had time to build a legacy. But come on, seasons from now, 10 seasons, 20 seasons from now, I find it very hard to believe we won't be talking about Banu when we talk about Survivor 46, unless like the next few boots are Kenzie, Tiffany, and Q back to back to back, and it's kind of like a Palau situation where we could just kind of think about the Yanu tribe as a whole. But even if you think of the Yanu tribe as a whole, Banu is such a focal point. Even in episode 1, when he's not in any danger, him at Tribal Council being like, it's time to read the votes, and basically telling Jelinski he's going to go home. I mean, that's memorable. And then episode 2, where he's still not really on the radar to go home, but makes himself a target because he gets up in the middle of Tribal Council and starts asking people, you know, if we're good, we're good, we're good, when the Jess boot is happening, and him in the challenge screaming at Jess. Obviously, that was edited to be a lot worse than it probably actually was, especially given what Jess has said in preseason or exit interviews, postseason exit interviews, I should say. But Banu, obviously, the 3rd and 4th episode, though, is really where it is the Banu show. The 3rd episode, kind of spending the whole time crying, saying, I'm going home, only for the 4th episode to be his real boot episode, which I know can be overbearing for people, but when talking about most memorable characters, how do you not remember it? You know, how do you not remember this guy? And if this season ends up having a negative tint to it because Banu was such a focal point that it didn't allow us to see everyone else and get to know everyone else, which I would combat because, you know, these are 90-minute episodes, and I feel like aside from Tim, I really know everyone else pretty dang well on this season. But even if this season is not necessarily looked at too favorably, I still think Banu is going to be one of the most memorable contestants in the pre-merge ever. And so much so to where I think right now, I don't think there's a pre-merger in the new era who is as visible as Banu. I don't think there's a pre-merger ever as visible as Banu in terms of confessional count. But as I said at the top of the video, this is confessional count based on the amount of time of the episode. So, you know, 35 confessionals or whatever in 4 episodes, but those 4 episodes are 2 hours long, 90 minutes and 90 minutes. I mean, that's a lot to where who's to say who these next 3 contestants I'm about to name, who's to say what they would have gotten had their episodes been 90 minutes or 2 hours? Like, I don't know. But Banu, I really do think will stand the test of time as one of the great flameouts of the early pre-merge game. And whether you love him or not, I mean, he is memorable. And I do like Banu. I think he's a great person. I think it was a little too much in the edit. I think they over-edited him to where any sort of, you know, suspense to his boot was kind of tarnished. But again, they didn't really even need to make it suspenseful because it was such a unique situation. But he is one of the most memorable contestants, bar none, not even just pre-merge, but of this new era. At number 3 is someone who obviously got a lot of confessionals based on the circumstances of the season, but is still such a very big focal point that I think we're going to be thinking of her from seasons and seasons to come because she kind of had this great story, and that is Reem from Edge of Extinction. This is the only first boot I'm putting on my list. Kind of a cheat because we saw her the whole season, so it's hard to say. But even if you look at like seasons like South Pacific or seasons like Redemption Island or Blood versus Water, where people are on these islands for a long period of time, I feel like nobody from those seasons, except for maybe Christine, is a real big focal point of their seasons, whereas Reem is the focal point of Edge of Extinction. Obviously, some would say it's Rick, and Rick was a big focal point, but I think Reem even more so because the Edge is such an important part of the season. And it's really interesting that Reem gets a better edit than the winner himself, who comes off of the Edge. But Reem is just such a great character. She soaks up so much great airtime, but deservingly so, because she is such a joy to watch. And I do think she is going to be one of the most memorable figures in Survivor when we look at pre-mergers seasons from now, even though her season is still very recent. But my top 2 are really catastrophic messes on their seasons, but really provide the season with so much entertainment. And at number 2, I'm going to put Drew Christie from San Juan del Sur. Now, Drew kind of has the Natalie Cole thing where a lot of people remember him for one moment. But the thing is, his moment is really his whole boot episode. It starts from the very beginning where he's like, we need to throw the challenge to get out Kelly. We need to throw out the challenge to get out Kelly. And then obviously his tribe throws the challenge and then votes him out. And it's one of the biggest single episode downfalls of all time. Now, some might be saying, why is he all the way at number 2 if it's just a single episode? Well, here's why. Because I think because Kelly Wentworth's legacy has gotten bigger, I think that makes Drew Christie's legacy bigger. Because Kelly's the person he was trying to boot. And Kelly goes home the very next week or the next week after that or the next episode. So I think at the time, Drew would have been lower because it would have been like, wow, what a big flame out of one episode. Sucks to see. He's a memorable figure nonetheless. But now because Kelly has gone on to become one of the most like beloved players in Survivor history, I think it makes him even more memorable because he did this grand gesture of throwing this challenge to get out one of the best players of the game, only to get himself sniped out of the game. I think it's one of the great downfalls. I also think his dynamic with Alec on that season, while it could have been highlighted more, is still a highlight because of the way San Juan del Sur is with these kind of family members going against each other, and because it's not Blood versus Water, the original, where you have returning players who are obviously going to get more screen time than their loved ones. Here, there are no returning players, so you don't have to compete against someone who's already played the game before. So in terms of screen time, it also helps because you get a lot more of them, a lot more of the newbies, because there are no returning players. So I think you get a lot of Drew, even though Drew's episode is really what makes Drew such a memorable pre-merge character. But also, if you think about San Juan del Sur, and I like to think about all of these boots as someone who really embodies the pre-merge of their season. And if you look at San Juan del Sur pre-merge, I think Drew's the first person who comes to mind. Just the whole Drew storyline of being on this dominant tribe and doing so well in challenges only to turn around and tank them in order to get out one of the now best players of the game, only to get sniped out himself. I think it's one of the most memorable downfalls, and I think only with time, Drew Christie will become even more indoctrined into the history of catastrophic, memorable pre-merge characters. But number one, should be no surprise if you listened to my video of the most catastrophic tribes on Survivor, and this is partially why this Brains tribe is so catastrophic, and it is Jatia from Cagayan. Cagayan in and of itself has one of the most memorable casts, bar none. Obviously, some of the endgame players like Tony and Cass and Wu are very memorable, but all the pre-mergers, pretty much all of them are memorable. I mean, David Sampson, a memorable first boot. Garrett, obviously very memorable. Bryce, obviously very memorable, especially now so with his podcasting career. And then, of course, you have Jatia, who is one of the most catastrophic players, but one of the most entertaining players. And again, I say this out of love because I love watching Jatia, and I respect her, and I love her, and I actually know she's battling cancer right now. So my heart and my best well wishes go out towards Jatia. But if you look at Cagayan, the reason why Cagayan is such a great season is because of how crazy the pre-merge is, and a lot of the reason why the pre-merge is so crazy is because of Jatia and because of the entertainment she brings. So I think we have a lot to owe Jatia for the success of Cagayan, because think about it. They could vote Jatia out either first or second, and then Garrett goes on, he has an idol, maybe the Brains win a few, and Garrett ends up being a bigger player in the grand scheme of Survivor. But the fact that you get rid of Garrett second, over someone who poured the rice out on your tribe and made this big fit, I mean, it really makes the season. It really makes the season when you go back and watch it. And the good news about Cagayan is it keeps up through the merge. Like the merge boot with Sarah is really great, and then obviously Tony's run to the end is really amazing, to where I don't think Cagayan loses steam, but it definitely has so much steam from its beginning because of that Brains tribe, because of Jatia, and because I think Tasha, Cass, and Spencer, now Riemann, are very memorable figures in Survivor as well. I think it helps that she's on that tribe too, because we look at that tribe so memorably in the grand lens of the game as well. But I think Jatia, when I was putting this list together, she was automatically my number one, just because if I think of all-time memorable pre-merge players, I think of that tribe, and I think of Garrett and Jatia, and especially Jatia being kind of that figurehead of the chaos of that tribe, and not in a way that like Matt Singh is in the Philippines, because as I said in my video a few weeks ago with the most disastrous tribes on Survivor, Matt Singh gets rid of their most chaotic player first with Zayn, and then they go Roxy, who's their next most chaotic, and then Angie. Like, it is a very systematic way they go about voting people out, whereas here it's just kind of chaos. Like, they vote out David first, which makes sense, but then they go for Garrett next, and then Jatia. I mean, it's just so all over the place. To where I really do think Jatia is so much to add to this overall, legacy of Survivor, and also coming into the game as a rocket scientist and being on the Brains tribe and being the one to like pour out the rice and do these things that we would kind of call idiotic, even though I don't think it's necessarily idiotic. It's also part of the edit. But Jatia is one of the great all-time pre-merge players, so or at least characters. None of these players are particularly good. I would say Matthew is a very good player. I would say Reem has the makings to be a good player. I think Alan Ball has some competency. I think Cowboy obviously came up with a great strategy, but everyone else on this list is a pretty bad player. I mean, Kathy's a bad player. I think Sandy's a terrible player. I think Natalie Cole's a bad player. I think Banu's a pretty bad player. Drew Christie, obviously a bad player. And Jatia, I think, is a pretty bad player. But it's what makes them so memorable, is because they're bad at the game. And I mean that with all the love in my heart, because let's be honest, I would much rather see a season where everyone is so all over the place and so messy and so chaotic and causes so much drama than a bunch of people going out because, oh, they're a very smart player, they're a very savvy player, let's snipe them out before they make it to the end. And just a season of game bots, which we have seen on some seasons of Survivor, of just like the pre-merge just being made up of these like very quiet, very, savvy players. I think it's really a lot of fun when you get these big explosive personalities. So that was my list for the top 10 most memorable pre-mergers in Survivor, at least one-time pre-mergers. But even if you factor in returning players, I think these 10 are very memorable. I mean, maybe you could add some other players, like Sandra from Game Changers has a great pre-merge run. JT from Game Changers has a great run there. I mean, obviously Boston Rob on Heroes vs. Villains. But again, that's kind of not in the spirit of this. This is to highlight the players who have only played once but have still made an impact on the game. So that's the list. Let me know if you agree, if I missed anyone, especially on the long list of honorable mentions. Let me know if I missed anyone. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for more Survivor content coming up soon. I hate that C word content, but it is. These are the contents of my channel, and they are art, and I work very hard on them. So if you like this, please like and subscribe to this channel, and stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching.